Welcome back to Breaking Badness. Today we're diving into the fast-evolving world of endpoint detection and response. As organizations continue to face advanced threats, EDR is proving to be a critical layer in cybersecurity defense. We'll explore how EDR has shifted from its early days of signature-based detection to today's machine learning and AI-driven solutions. From managing massive amounts of endpoint telemetry to uncovering advanced attacks, our guests will shed light on key innovations shaping the future of endpoint security. Joining us are Carl Froggett, Chief Information Officer at Deep Instinct, who will break down the role of deep learning in EDR, and Melissa Bischoping, Senior Director of Security at Tanium, sharing insights on the challenges of data overload and how to stay ahead of the threat curve. With your hosts, Callie Fensel, Sean McNee, and Daniel Schwalbe, let's get started on our journey into the complex and vital role of EDR in modern cybersecurity.
For our listeners, before we get too deep in the weeds, can you describe how endpoint detection and response, EDR, has typically worked?
Yeah, so if you look, and again, part of my career was moving from what I'll call a signature-based technology solution back in the day, moving into EDR. And EDR's not new, it's got to be at least 15 years old at this point. From an EDR perspective, at the time, the challenge was really twofold. One, the threat landscape moved. Mm-hmm. And back in the day, and I'm happy to get into the detail, we had signatures and a new virus came out. We didn't call it malware back in the day, right? A new virus came out. You'd write a new signature and you'd be fine. And then the bad actors changed and they started to find out different ways of bypassing signatures. And one of those ways was just to alter a virus a little bit to get a variant, bypasses the signature. And then what that meant was constant signature updates, right? And then ultimately you start having performance and other issues on the endpoint because the signature data is getting too big. So the bad guys were bypassing it, and then we started having issues. And then EDR came along, which was, if you think back in the day, hey, we don't have a technology that can actually prevent what's happening here. So if you think signatures in the 80s and the 90s prevented things. Yeah. So we got into a culture, if you like, we can't prevent, so we're going to detect and respond, and that's the DR. Mm-hmm. And again, way back then, that really put the bad actors back on the back foot because now we had a more fluid way, I'll call it, of getting updates. But we didn't have the technology to actually do prevention. So what we ended up doing as an industry was leveraging the other thing that was exploding at the time, which was the internet and cloud, right? So now you get analytics up in the cloud, constant updates from the cloud, augment that with an endpoint and EDR. And the whole idea was if something bad happens over here, you can at least get the updates out so it doesn't happen to everybody. So yeah, that's the evolution of how we got to EDR. Really from some of the big breaches at the time, the Sony movies, Sony PlayStation, the bad actors were in that network for a year or longer. Right, Target is another one in the US, a similar kind of thing. So that's how we got into this EDR detect and respond phase.
Thank you so much, Carl.
If we start taking this to the next level, now the next new thing is AI, right? And so if you take EDR where it's at with discovering certain signatures and pushing them down to the clients, now with AI, you can probably start doing things like, this seems likely or similar to other events that are happening. So you talk about how AI is folding into this mix now or removing?
Yeah, and again, I'm trying to keep it kind of vendor generic here. EDR today, most of the big players certainly, it's machine learning. It's a form of AI, and it always has been. So they may run a machine learning kind of endpoint, I'll call it, but they certainly using machine learning in their cloud to do analytics. Now again, 10, 15 years ago, this was great. The bad actors were put on the back foot. But what, like all good technologies, right, it's an arms race, and now the bad actors have found many ways to bypass EDR, right? They've had many years to probe and discover, and actually I think at DEF CON next week, some of our threat researchers at Deep Instinct are going to present 3 new kind of methods of doing this. So that's the challenge. So EDR already has AI in it, and we see this all the time in the marketing, right? AI, right? Yeah, okay, we all have it. We're carrying it in our pockets. So what the audience need to look at is what sort of AI. Most AI that everybody's talking about in this hall here A black hat is machine learning. Deep Instinct is machine learning, which is an advanced subset of machine learning. So it's still all AI under that marketing umbrella, but it's really important to understand the differences and how they work. And there's some fundamental differences between machine learning and deep learning that bring a lot of value when you're talking about threat and prevention of threat using deep learning over machine learning.
Well, because in deep learning, you can create certain models and you can do transfer learning from one model to another model. So certain data you learn from, you can find these patterns, the neural networks, you can have these layers. You can say, I'm going to reuse some of these layers for a new model, where you can take other data and apply it and build additional layers and compress them down. You can have fun where models fight against each other to learn their differences. Deep learning is a whole new world.
And this is one of the fundamental differences of deep learning over machine learning. Machine learning needs to be constantly trained, constantly updated, which is why we have this big ecosystem from those current approaches. They're, like I say, are 10 to 15 years old. They've had a good run. Mm-hmm. But I think if you look at the breaches and some of the high-profile breaches, we've got to start to say, hey, it's not living up anymore. Just like signatures started to degrade in the face of the bad actors figuring it out, we're already seeing that with that EDR machine learning approach. We need a more preventative approach, right? And the bad actors are now leveraging the same generative AI to create their attack chain end to end. So if I put it out there that, 2 years ago, like ChatGPT made a big splash, right? So we're less than 2 years in to this cycle of bad actors figuring out how to use generative AI to create advanced malware, deep fakes. When ChatGPT was released in the following couple of months, phishing went up by almost 1,300%.
Oh, wow.
Because guess what? Bad actors go, hey, I've got a new tool. How can I use it? Just like the good guys are trying to do the defense, they're doing the attack. And any numbers I quote here today, I'm happy to share.
Oh, yeah.
It's not all Deep Instinct research. I try and pull, because like I say, cyber's a community kind of team sport.
Oh, yeah.
So I pull that in from all over the place,
It's incredibly easy, right? You go to ChatGPT and you're like, hey, can you help me write a letter to my grandma explaining the virtues of cryptocurrency? And it's like, sure, I'm happy to do that for you. And a couple small modifications, and it's a perfect fish.
And that's what we're seeing. If I go to we did a Voice of the SecOps, which is a report that we do. If we look at some of the statistics in there about the threat of generative AI, and this report is from practitioners, right? Mm-hmm. I'm very keen to stress this is not a CISO or whatever. This is security operations. These are the people who are using the tools that we all provide every day as a community from a cyber perspective. So it's an interesting take, because I say this is like real life. Mm-hmm. Yeah, they're really worried about the use of generative AI. I like to talk about the University of Indiana published some research in January. So bearing in mind, ChatGPT was 2 years ago? They published some research, and I can't remember the numbers off the top of my head, but they found over 13,000 dark AI, which is the new term from Gartner. So they found over 13,000 LLMs, generative AI, on the dark web that had either been compromised or the safeguards removed so that they could be weaponized by the bad actors, right? That's a crazy number. And then they found LLMs and services that were stitching it together, from writing the phishing email to your grandma about cryptocurrency, if I want to twist it a little bit, delivering a newly written, unique malware that's never been seen before, right? Analyzing the vulnerabilities of how they're going to use it. And we're only at the start of this. It's only been 2 years. So, again, pivoting back to the Voice of the SecOps, you can see we've been here before. Signatures degraded. We had to shift, right? And we're seeing it again. That's just it. If you don't like change, you really should be working in cyber. Because, it just happens all the time.
As we move into the Gen AI world, right now you have chatbots and now you have AI assistants.
Oh, wow.
Yep. All right. So Deep Instinct has Diana, which is a fantastic name. Alice, note that other vendors have their own chatbots or other LLM-based solutions. Notably, CrowdStrike has Charlotte. So you have Diana and you have Charlotte.
Can't say anything bad about Charlotte because that was my daughter's name.
So what I really want to know is, Diana and Charlotte, are they friends? Do they talk to each other?
No, they're complementary, and again, having run teams for 30 years in technology and almost 25, 27 in cyber. If you look at the co-pilot Charlottes and whatever, what are they trying to do? They're adding a veneer on, they're covering the problem up. What is the problem? The problem is SOC burnout. That the tools we have today are generating too much useless data. That the SOC analyst has to look at now. If you think of what a SOC analyst wants, what do they want to know? Did I prevent something from happening, or do I have an incident that I need to clean up? Now, that's a very simple question, but on the data that they have, to sift through all that data is the challenge. So instead of fixing the root cause of the problem, because that's maybe expensive and going to take time, what the industry has done is say, hey, we'll just leverage some of this AI stuff and we'll try and sort through the data because AI is good at sorting through data. So they're not really addressing the root cause of the problem, right? But they are putting a Band-Aid over and layering and covering the fact that we have a lot of data that really not adding any value. And when I say value, what's the ultimate value? It's really to prevent something bad from happening.
Yep.
Or if something did happen, and look, nothing's perfect, everything, then you want to get to it quickly. So that they help in that regard, but then they're not really solving the problem. What Diana does is, one of our challenges with deep learning when I joined 2 years ago was, how do I know that it's an unknown malware? So we have many examples of our brain, our deep learning core, that's over a year old. So we don't update it, and actually some of our biggest customers run in entirely air-gapped environments. So there's no cloud connectivity, there's no internet. Because as you were saying, it's a neural network. It makes its own decisions. It doesn't need to refer, which is a unique advantage of deep learning. But when it's running in that mode, it has to make a decision of, hey, this is a new piece of malware. We just got talking, the bad guys are constantly innovating. They're creating new and sophisticated malware. This is the zero-day malware. Mm-hmm. So our customers were, hey, I see you said you prevented something, but I've never seen it before, so how do I know it's bad? Mm-hmm. Obviously, two things. One, we actually, in the console, we give them metadata as to why it was considered a threat. Mm-hmm. The more advanced customers would take the file or take the whatever and do the usual sandboxing and whatever. Now, anybody who's done that, I've done it a little bit, takes hours or days depending on the complexity of the malware. And the bad actors know this. So they build in timers so it doesn't detonate. So it makes it really difficult. What Diana does using a mix of generative AI is answer that question, but answers it in seconds. So it is a total static analysis of a file. And if it has bad content, it will write in seconds, usually around 20 seconds, depending on the complexity, write a plain English report as to why we think it's bad, the code segments, the indicators. So it basically does that really complex analysis that can take days in seconds using generative AI. It helps us answer hey, in the new world where malware is always going to be new and unknown, we can now give you a nice plain report as to why that is. Using, like I say, our kind of deep learning core with some extra pieces on the side. And then from a SOC perspective, they're not wasting days and hours with sandboxes and evasion and whatever. They can actually get to the value, because what's the business of a SOC? To protect the company. So they can get to that value and their objective in seconds rather than wasting time. Still, take your time. Go and do an analysis in a sandbox and go and take your time. But you want to do that when you're not responding to something, right? You want to do that when you know that actually the business is safe. Okay, this is interesting. Let's go and look at it. But we do that analysis in seconds. So that's a fundamental difference between the two. But you can see how I can say they're complementary, but one of them's kind of not really addressing the root cause of the problem.
I could see Diana saying, hey, found something new. Here's some IOCs. Dear Charlotte, please take these IOCs and make sure that's deployed out or do whatever you need to do.
Yeah, it's really, it is a bit of a wow. Because, I've deployed everything, sandboxes and whatever that do the analysis, right? And it's not only that it takes somebody hours or days, it's usually like the real expert. So from a SOC manager perspective, it's the really expensive person, usually, right? And you can only do so many of these at a time because they're very detailed. So this is a real kind of disruptive use case of deep learning and generative AI. There's not just trying to plaster out. We're actually solving a real problem here, not just putting a Band-Aid on something.
So if we rip off the Band-Aid, then part of the core problem here is concerns of SOC teams burning out. Beyond AI and Diana, what other strategies do you think teams can employ to help SOC teams not burn out? Are there other processes, practices, other things you can fold in to give SOC teams some love?
I think it's a challenge. It's a challenge because, and I'm going a little bit here off the voice of the SecOps, but I'm also just people that I know in the industry who run SOC teams. I know a few of them. One of their prime, when we talk about burnout, we often, as I just did, we focus on the volume of data, and they chase their tails and end up spending hours. SOC analysts will spend hours on a case that turns out to be a false positive. So they've just wasted hours, and here's the key piece, added no value to their business because they just chased down a ghost. Okay. So this comes back to the quality of data going in, being able to figure all that stuff out, and then coming down. So I'm certainly thinking, I'm not going to mention names, but two people in my mind that say, you know why my analysts leave? It's just they have no job satisfaction. They end up chasing and they're constrained by the data or the bad data and the tools, and they leave because they feel they have no job satisfaction. They didn't do what they wanted to do, which was protect the company. They end up chasing more false positives than not. So that's a really, from a people perspective, we all want to do a good job, right? And we all want to feel that we're adding value. So this is what they're saying is it's because most SOC level 1, level 2 analysts on a shift pattern, so it's not hours. It's not the number of hours. It's just that it's a bit of a thankless job. Anybody who's worked in operations, a good day in the office is when the phone doesn't ring, right? But when the phone does ring, somebody says thank you. That's a great day in the office. It's the same with SOC, right? They don't want anything to happen, but when most of their time is spent with bad data, volumes of data, trying to piece something together, and they're chasing false positives. I think we need to look at that element. I think the other thing as well is there's a lot of investment in tools in SOC, not necessarily the people, right? I think that's another element. Again, in my experience, most SOC members are working shift patterns, so it's not like a burnout from an hours, that perspective. It's more on that kind of side is what I would say, beyond the tool set.
Sure.
What would you say is new with Endpoint? From trends with COVID, are they here to stay, or how would you say orgs have changed their security posture in the last few years?
I think for the 2 or 3 years right after the big COVID shift and the work from home, everybody was like, oh, we're going to have to approach, nobody's in the office anymore, and soft inner surface, hard outer shell. But I think we're moving past that. That is the norm now. That's not really news to anyone. I think, however, we're seeing more conversations shift back to how do we deal with just the insane amount of data that comes at us from all the different sources. And Endpoint specifically, which is where I focus, the Endpoint is a source of an insane amount of data. There's so much telemetry you can pull, and that's just from one single system. So being able to make sense of that data and take that growing, because every day more devices come online, more applications enter your environment, more users are involved in these systems. Being able to help your analysts, your incident responders, your researchers make sense of this influx of data is where the conversation seems to be going.
So when you say there's so much data at Endpoint, how do you make sense of it? From your perspective, what has been helpful or impactful for you in sorting through that?
Yeah, I think you really have to like statistics. And I feel like Sean can probably relate to that statement. I have a saying where I'm like, there's no such thing as bad data. There's data that's just badly represented or badly interpreted, so to speak. Yeah, exactly. It's the data itself can all be useful and valid if you're approaching it in the right context. So building solid hypotheses, and as a researcher specifically, understanding what it is you're actually asking and being okay running up against some dead ends while you're designing the right metrics, the right telemetry to collect so that you can continue to refine. I have empathy for the people who receive the alerts that's based off the kind of research and data analysis that people are doing. I think that we have a responsibility to not just throw more alerts at folks. We have a responsibility to say we're refining that down so that when you actually get this notification or this piece of information, between the human insight behind it, the automated analysis, any of the like AI tools that are getting layered on top, it's higher fidelity. I think that's how we solve the problem.
So there's no such thing as bad data. I love that statement, rather. I guess my question would be, like, in sorting through that, can you describe like a situation where maybe you had to fail first to parse through that sort of data, like to get to something that was correct, like maybe like just a different pathway, so to speak, if that makes sense?
So let's say when we're making a hypothesis based on like a new campaign that's being seen in the wild, be it like, okay, cyber criminals change their tactics, right? And we like to think sometimes that we know what they're going to do because we've watched them or we've learned from their behavior in the past. And sometimes that can cause you to hypothesize with bias. So I am a big advocate for recognizing that bias exists, the bias in how we make decisions about what we're collecting, and being open to being wrong. I've run into it myself where I'm like, no, there's no way. Like there has to be something here. This telemetry, I know this threat actor is going to be hiding in this location. Yeah. And it's not there. And so you have to actually step back and go back and analyze the facts, analyze the data that you had, and be open to being wrong. And I tell people getting into this field specifically, if you're into research or detection engineering, you've got to be okay being wrong more often than you are right, because threat hunting, detection engineering, and security research specifically, a lot of times you are faced with a lot of unknowns, and you have to be okay accepting those as unknowns and accepting that you may not find the answer you were looking for.
You always want to make sure that the teams you're providing data to and the value, that when they see something, they're saying like, oh, there's actually a potential problem here. There could be a breach. There could be an incident. And you want to minimize the time people are spending chasing ghosts. How have you worked to help with the prioritization of the data that you're sending, or hints around what we think is real versus what might be a ghost in the machine?
Yeah, so correlation is the first word that comes to mind in that, right? We're not a threat intelligence provider, but if you look at organizations that do provide threat intelligence feeds that are high quality, being able to start correlating data helps you trim away those initial, let's get rid of the low-hanging fruit first, and let's go after what we have a much higher chance of being successful with. But I think the most important thing actually isn't even a technical piece at all. It's having the cross collaboration between your threat intel teams, your incident response teams, your forensics who are doing like live research on the fly, and keeping them all plugged in together, because so often those teams are working in silos and one of them has a light bulb moment that could really change the trajectory of another team's investigation and save them a lot of time.
Yeah. So how do you help break down those silos and build that collaboration?
We talked about I took a scenic route into this industry, and part of that scenic route was in the psychology space. So I have a background educationally in psychology, and one of the things I was really fascinated in was how groups form and how groups communicate. This really is a human problem. Like, human beings are very smart creatures. We're really good at seeing patterns and noise. People need to be empowered to reach across their organization. I think we have to create these sort of flat structures, because in a crisis or in an incident, you need to be able to reach out to the people who have the information most valuable to you at that moment in time. So as a technical leader, if you've got these kind of teams in your organization, foster from day one, foster the opportunity for them to, like, hey, you're never going to get in trouble for going to ask for more information. Do the exercises together. Create tabletop exercises where you encourage that collaboration as part of the process. That is always an opportunity for improvement, because the number of times that I've talked to customers and that I've talked to friends in the industry where they're like, man, if I had only known, like, our network team actually had information on this from 2 weeks ago, but we never heard. Like, we didn't know. So if you're a technical leader, you need to be fostering collaboration. If you're a technical practitioner, be that champion and go to your leadership and say, hey, we want to start doing tabletops. We want to start doing these knowledge transfer sessions. And you start learning the people in your org that have all of the little nuggets of ideas and wisdom. And it's really beautiful when it starts to blossom.
That's awesome. I love that. I think we're seeing that too at our organization, which is really great. But there's challenges to that too in terms of we live in a remote, Tanium also remote.
Yep.
Zoom's remote first as we are. How do you bridge that gap when you're working far away? Like we have Slack, we have email, but it's sometimes difficult to have that collaboration, try and bridge that gap. So what are your recommendations?
Yeah, so I started at Tanium back in 2020 when everyone was remote, obviously. And now we're going to hybrid. We still have a lot of folks that are remote, but we have folks at several offices around the country. And it's a different type of collaboration. We make an effort to go be on site with each other or do like team offsites, but that's not really a replacement for the day-to-day. So I've seen, at least with our culture, we spin up, hey, we're going to do like game nights over Zoom or whatever, just as like social get together. The stuff that we would normally do, hey, we're a team, we're all going to go out for watch a baseball game, which our Raleigh office overlooks a baseball field. So they actually do go watch baseball games in Durham. I think I said this a minute ago, it comes from the top. If you have a culture that fosters like that continuous collaboration and building relationships among teams, that's going to transcend the distance. I make a point of just reaching out to people and going, so what do you do? Tell me what your job is. I'm curious. What I've learned is that people love to talk about themselves and they love to talk about their work. And all of a sudden you're going to hear them say something that you can file away and be like, this is a person we should pull into this huddle. This is a person we should pull into this project or this tiger team that we're standing up. Find other individuals in the organization that can champion that and just go. It literally is networking within your own company.
Shifting back to thinking about threat research for a sec.
Okay.
Business email compromise.
Yep.
Versus ransomware. The steel cage death match. Threats to organizations. How do you feel they're doing against each other? Is business email compromise still like top threat organizations should worry about, or is ransomware like taking over?
I think they are not mutually exclusive, for one. But the business email compromise conversation has surged in probably the last 2 years. Like it comes up more and more in almost every conversation. I'm seeing it as leading causes, seeing every report. I think you have to look at it, and I'm not an actuarial scientist. I don't calculate that kind of risk for a living. But when you look at the damage to a business's reputation, the trust in their organizations that they do business with, and the impact of business email compromise, I think there's a longer tail of impact. Ransomware, a lot of organizations, you have that temporary lapse in trust or maybe temporary lapse in operations, but the long-term damage of losing the trust of your customers, your partners, that can really, that is a harder to quantify risk, but I think it's a significant risk. That said, I have a passion for cybercrime research. And so ransomware specifically is where I have always tailored, that's what pricks my ears up a little bit. It's going to be interesting to see. I think we have to, I tell people though, if you just never open your email, we'll be okay. We'll be fine. I think this is a perfect justification to not do email anymore.
So do you think there will be other forms of compromise that's not business email? Will there be Slack compromise? Will there be Messenger compromise?
That's an interesting way to, we're already seeing situations where attackers are getting into environments. We read reports on breaches where an attacker, once they're in the environment, they are setting up their own accounts. They are sitting in your Microsoft Teams or your Slack instance and watching your comms in real time, which is one of the reasons I tell people, make sure you cut your out-of-bound communications for incidents. I think that anytime an organization can capitalize, it's a new type of living off the land. It's living off the cloud. It's living off the enterprise, effectively. I think anytime they can leverage those existing tools and capabilities to further their goals or burn the trust, they're going to do. Why reinvent the wheel? I think, especially if you're in a situation where you've got single sign-on and they've got access to all these different communications mediums, absolutely. I haven't seen a ton of evidence of that, but that's not my specific area of research. Wouldn't surprise me, though.
In your research, the work that you've done, what has been the most interesting threat actor that you've studied and come across?
Yeah, so I've done a lot of deep dives in the last probably year or two on bootloader, which is, so they do malvertising, use that to drop their initial payload and oftentimes leads to ransomware. Really interesting to see the kind of stuff that they go after as far as lures, because they're operating on targeted ad placement, using search engine optimization to drive traffic to compromise blogs and then get you to click on something and download it. And to a security trained individual or to a decently technical individual, their TTPs are obvious. It's no, don't click on that JavaScript file and open it. No, don't do that. But to the average person who is searching for a template for legal frameworks, that's a common one that I see. They're just looking for an answer to solve a problem really quick. And maybe they're coming from like a small office where we don't have template software to build legal forms. We need to go download one. Those techniques still working is still fascinating to me. Yeah. And the fact that like looking at this threat actor and their TTPs, they're not really sophisticated. It's very basic stuff, but it's still successful. And I think that is the part that keeps me awake at night, is how successful some of those really like threat actor 101 techniques are continuing to be.
I know we don't want to talk about AI again, Sean, but I feel like we have to approach it just a little bit. Like, how would you say that's influencing your research? What or any significant impact in the last year or 5 years that you'd like to address?
Yeah, I think so. I tell people when I talk about AI, I don't like to use the word artificial intelligence. I like to say we're augmenting intelligence because the human actually still has to have some thought here. Yeah. AI is allowing us on the good guy side, like on the researcher side, it's allowing us to process data and make decisions faster. And it's doing the stats at a much faster rate than any of us could before, helping us explain that in plain English to the people receiving that information with the large language models that have come out. But it's not a silver bullet. And you still have to have the human insight and that sort of like gut feeling, that researcher like pull of, I need to go pull at this thread and see what's here to target it effectively. Mm-hmm. Otherwise, you can't just spray AI at the world and say, what are we going to find? So I think on the defender side, I really sincerely hope that we're going to make information easier to digest. We're going to deal with some of the alert fatigue. We're going to help process that data a little more, make it a little more refined by the time it gets to your tier one analyst who's reviewing it, freeing up their time to continue to advance their skills, which then addresses the ongoing skill shortage that we always talk about. On the offensive side, I know initially it was like, oh, there's going to be like wormable AI malware. I'm not losing sleep over that yet. I am seeing a lot more sincere conversation and risk around how are large language models changing phishing scams? How are they changing things like misdis and malinformation, which is top of mind for me. That's one of the things I'm watching, like the Twitter bots getting in arguments with each other when both of them are in AI is...
That's so funny to me.
This was not the future I envisioned for anyone. So watching the adversaries using it to scale up these social engineering and information campaigns, which shows a lot of, even if you don't believe what the AI is telling you, it's planting seeds of distrust in the system and in a communications platform. Yeah. And once people lose trust, they say trust is earned in drops and lost in bucket. And I think that's one of the bigger risks posed, more than wormable malware and all of those kind of big, scary nightmare scenarios. I think it's the impact on trust and the impact on social engineering.
How can we gamify security preparedness and build team efficiency in these threat situations? Like, how would you do that?
I love this topic. Yes. Back in high school, I grew up playing RPGs and Magic the Gathering, D&D, and Vampire the Masquerade. I was one of those kids. I think that those same principles, that same interest of role-play games and tactical and strategy games resonates with a lot of my peers in the industry. And we're starting to see more of that in the way we build CTFs, so capture the flags. I'm actually a huge proponent of capture the flags for people trying to break into the industry, because a lot of them, especially .org, which is some folks from Microsoft started it, but it's a nonprofit. They're actually using data from real world scenarios using like Azure KQL queries to help you do the forensics and investigate in a gamified scenario, like with the leaderboard and everything else. Yeah. We've got the folks at Black Hills InfoSec who did backdoors and breaches.
Yes.
Yeah. That is, it weirdly, I'm the kind of person that has pulled that out at a party. Yeah. When you take the risk of, let's say you're a hospital or a school, in a real world situation, real lives are on the line. There's a lot of stress. There's a lot of pressure. When you remove that immediate pressure and you're like, let's do this as a game. Let's actually like challenge each other and get that competitive spirit that is what drives a lot of people to get into this industry. All of a sudden innovation comes out and people are like, what if we did this wild and crazy thing that they would never be willing to do in a real world situation untested, but it spawns a future conversation about a change to a playbook or a change. Mm-hmm. And so I think gamification is important because it plays to the strengths of competitiveness that is so core to almost everyone I know in this industry, myself included. But it also takes some of that pressure and risk off and allows you to explore new ways of doing things in low threat situations.
So you mentioned backdoors and breaches. Is there another game within this industry that you like other than Capture the Flag, or is that kind of like the pillar of the industry right now in terms of I created a game based off of another game?
Yeah, and I don't know of any. So if anybody does have comments or whatever, I would love to hear about them. We've got like the National Cyber League, which is a competitive collegiate and high school CTF program that does a lot of different stuff. And then there's a couple of different platforms that do CTF-esque stuff. But as far as we need more tabletop games.
I would love more tabletop
We need more tabletop games.
And I want it to be beautiful, like parks. Maybe the National Parks. I just played it. It's a gorgeous game. Or Everdell. Also a gorgeous game.
No, we need more games.
Yes.
We need more games, and I think there's definitely an appetite for it. And I think it should even go beyond just incident response and like security investigations. We can even get into things like risk and GRC and being able to understand how we're applying strategic thought to minimizing risk from a game board.
And that's a wrap for today. A huge thanks to Carl and Melissa for their deep dive into the current state and future of EDR. We've explored how AI and deep learning are reshaping endpoint security and how organizations can sift through the immense amount of data and stay ahead of threats. We hope this episode gave you valuable insights into the importance of staying proactive in your EDR strategy. We also hope you have enjoyed our 5-part Black Hat series. And if you missed any of the episodes in the series, be sure to check them out as they are all live now. Next week, we'll go back to our usual schedule of what's new and catching our attention in the world of cybersecurity. Until then, thanks for listening and stay secure out there.
That's about all we have for this week. You can find us on Twitter @DomainTools. All of the articles mentioned today will be included in our blog post, which can be found at blog.domaintools.com. Catch us every Wednesday at 9 a.m. Pacific Time when we publish our podcast and blog. That's it for this week. We'll see you again next week on another episode of Breaking Badness. Until then, remember, don't drink and click.